Welcome. You're watching a Indus Afghan Special, a day which will go down in history once again. For the second time, one of the world's superpowers has left the playing field in Afghanistan. Late last night, on the stroke of midnight, the last US planes had left Afghanistan, leaving the playing field open to the Taliban, who had marched in on the 15th of August following a complete withdrawal by the Afghan forces in Afghanistan. Now, what are the implications? The Afghan Taliban come, they say, in peace. They say they will be moderate. They say that they will not flout all of those concerns that have been raised by the international community in their last tenure. Now, how do we get here? Of course, just for a quick recap, 9/11, some 20 years ago, an Al-Qaeda-led attack which resulted in the Afghan Taliban being dragged into this scenario with the Americans and Al-Qaeda. What has happened, what has transpired over the last 20 years, unfortunately by many had been predicted. This being described once upon a time as the graveyard for empires. Now, it has a lot of implications, not only for Afghanistan, but also for Pakistan, mainly for Pakistan, one would say, because Pakistan has indirectly been affected by this prolonged, protracted war for the last 20 years, and its spillover effects has affected Pakistan deeply due to the insurgency which Pakistan has seen as a result of the resistance which has been faced over the last 20 years by the Americans. A deal which was set out back in 2020 by the then President Trump to leave Afghanistan, albeit with some face saving. Now, at this particular juncture, nobody in the world is really sure what is going to happen next. Do we take it for granted that the Taliban will actually execute on those particular promises which it has made over the last 3 to 4 days? What will be of the region at large? Pakistan, how it will be affected. We've heard murmurs from China that they will welcome a moderate Taliban government, but it must be an all-inclusive government. As Pakistan has repeated, it must be a government which is an Afghan-led government. But there are many skeptics, especially the hawks sitting to Pakistan's eastern borders, who believe that Pakistan has been meddling unnecessarily and has been responsible for this resurgence of the Taliban and this rather quick capitulation by the Afghan forces. Now, to help us shed light on the matter, joined by a panel of guests. Firstly, let me introduce to you Ambassador Mohammad Ayaz Wazir. Quick recap of his history. He's a career diplomat, and he's also joined the Foreign Service back in 1974 and has served in the Ministry of Affairs, several missions on behalf of Pakistan. Welcome, Ambassador Wazir. Thank you for joining us. Next, we have Brigadier Nadir Mir. He is the chairman of the Pakistan National Reform Movement. Thank you, sir, for joining us as well. And over in Lahore, I have a journalist friend by the name of Moayyed Jafri. Thank you, Moayyed, for joining us as well. Let's just get over to Ambassador Wazir to begin with, sir. Of course, in many ways, as I said in my intro, something that had been predicted for many, many years, that this once been described as a graveyard of empires, has seen the United States and obviously its allies forced would be probably the best way to describe it, forced out of Afghanistan. Your initial reaction to the immediate aftermath of what we have seen, namely today the scenes that we saw at Kabul airport, the Afghan Taliban offering a statement that they have now taken control of the airport and have effectively waved the last US combatants out from Afghan airspace.
Well, I hope we all remember that the Taliban had said way back that the Americans have watches and we have the time. And so they were waiting for the right time to take action on diplomatic front, and then when it came to taking over Afghanistan, on both counts, I think they have given big surprises to the entire world. Nobody thought they would so shrewd, they were so intelligent, they were so diplomatic. But when they signed that agreement in Doha with the U.S. representative, everybody was taken aback, I would say. At least no, I was not expecting that kind of a concession given to the Taliban or to the group which was declared by the U.S. as blacklisted, as militant blacklisted. With the same blacklisted group, the sole superpower of the world sits and signs an agreement. As if that was not enough, then when the Taliban came at the door of Kabul, the agreement, I believe, between the two in Doha was that Taliban will not take over by force Kabul, and some kind of arrangement would be made with the Afghani government so that it's a smooth takeover or takeover by both. But then again, a big surprise, the same power which has removed the Taliban from Kabul begged the Taliban to come into Kabul to look after the law and order situation because Afghani has left the country. So that is quite a big surprise, I would say, to everyone. And America, whether they accept it as a defeat or not, everybody else considers it not only a defeat, but something much bigger in store for the sole superpower in the days ahead. When it comes, nobody knows, but something will certainly happen because this has greatly impacted the Americans politically.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, we've seen on both sides of the divide in the US of the decision to what many have been describing as a hasty retreat. But of course, this was all outlined by former President Trump. Just want to cross over now to Moayyed Jafri, just to get your sort of take on how the international, the media, and particularly international watchdogs and various different organizations have been viewing this rather liquid takeover, one could say. Straightforward, it seemed very much 15 days it's been, but we're still without an interim government in Kabul, so to speak. So a lot of worry, I would suggest, perhaps internationally, particularly those who say that the lessons from past incursions into Afghanistan have not been learnt, and we cannot afford to leave a vacuum this time around.
Thank you so much for having me. I agree with you, and I believe the last time the U.S. diplomats, and we all very infamously remember Hillary Clinton laying it out clearly in front of everybody that the U.S. should not repeat the mistakes it made in the past regarding Afghanistan. And yet they choose to do the same, and some might even argue that it was way worse this time. The question that you basically asked, as in how the international media is viewing all this fluid situation and the way this entire takeover took place, like Ambassador Wazir talked about the fact that the world is kind of trying to come to terms with this 2.0 Taliban version, albeit with a lot of skepticism, but their ability to maneuver situations, to understand them, and then to negotiate. Because a lot of these victories that came in quick time were not just military victories. It's difficult to digest this fact, but the support that they got, or the lack of support for government troops, at some level signifies some level of political victory as well. So these negotiations that went in during these military conflicts and the negotiations with the U.S., they've kind of forced the world media and everybody else to think again about who the Taliban really are and what are they actually dealing with right now. Now that they're in place, there is rising skepticism after the withdrawal of the United States, as we've seen U.S. Secretary of State Mr. Blinken. He was talking about the fact that the aid would not be given directly to the Taliban, and it would be channeled through international institutions and international bodies. So those are certain factors being viewed as a system of check and balance to keep the Taliban honest. And the international media is kind of, I'd hand it over to the Taliban, that they have convinced, not exactly, but to a certain degree, the international media, that they might be able to pull this one off without getting the same reputation that they had last time. And your question regarding the future and the state of Afghanistan, the latest from Afghanistan right now, our sources tell us, is that the negotiations for government formation among the Taliban factions, they have ended, and they have announced, or they will be announcing, said they'll be announcing in a couple of weeks, but our sources said that it'll be earlier than that. So that will basically define as to the first reaction by the world, depending upon how the government is formed. As you said earlier, Pakistan has been repeatedly pointing out and asserting the fact that the government in Afghanistan should be inclusive, it should not be exclusionary in any way, and it should represent the Afghan people. So once this first step takes place, only then we can imagine, and only then we can, derive some sort of a conclusion or extrapolate how this will move forward. And do the Taliban really have the capacity to operate a state at this point of time, and that too with these huge challenges?
Indeed, that's one of the conundrums facing the Afghan Taliban. Of course, a fully inclusive government. They have reached out. I mean, we've been recently hearing of the resistance in the Panjshir Valley, and there are reports suggesting that perhaps some breakthrough might be imminent. I just want to bring in Brigadier Nadir Mir. It's an awfully difficult conundrum to solve, Afghanistan, and especially the tribal factions and the different tribal warlords, somewhat unifying themselves under the flag of the Taliban for the moment. Do you think, Brigadier Mir, that the Afghan Taliban have had sufficient time to mull over a strategy of how they are going to place themselves within the international community? And as Moayyed Jafri has pointed out, how are they going to build on an economy for many which are saying is on the brink if they don't receive the necessary aid? Do you think they're well scripted, and this time away in the wilderness has allowed them to regroup and to think this through about how they are going to exist, and not only in the region, but how they are going to interact with the rest of the world now?
Well, Afghanistan has just seen a geostrategic climactic, which means it's a turning point actually in world history, because as I wrote in a recent article, Kabul and the non-polar world, well, it's on net, you can see it. And I'd also predicted in two of my books, Guada on the Global Chessboard, 2010, and Geopolitics, Pakistan, 2013, that the outcome of the Afghan war would eventually be that the Americans and NATO would be leaving. Well, I didn't write that they would be leaving in so much defeat in detail and disgrace as they have, but that's what has come to. So this is the actual picture. So it's not only created a geostrategic vacuum here, because since 9/11 and since the Americans came here, along with NATO and so many countries, that was the main show. Well, that show is over now. So the Americans are out. The American-NATO war in Afghanistan is finished. But the war itself in Afghanistan may not have finished. I mean, less the US-NATO war. What I mean is, like you've asked, that first of all, there are other factions and tribals and warlords in Afghanistan, and plus there are other players, chief of and spoilers, especially India. India hasn't given up on Afghanistan despite its defeat and disgrace. The Indians have been defeated also there because they were using Afghanistan as a second front against Pakistan for terrorism. But anyway, they're still at it, and they're trying to cobble together a Northern Alliance or some kind of groups which can fight the Afghan Taliban. That is one of the options they're trying to implement. Failing that, they will try to go to some other limits like ISIS, Daesh, whatever. So what I'm trying to say is that while all that is happening, we in Pakistan have to first ensure, which the army chief has also rightly said, that our western border, Pakistan's western border, northwestern border, is safe and secure from the terrorism which was emanating because there was a hostile regime in Kabul supported by Delhi. So that's the first point as far as Pakistanis are concerned. And secondly, of course, we want stability and peace in Afghanistan for the larger interest of the Afghan people who have suffered in the last 40, 50 years since the Soviet invasion. And also because, geoeconomics can take place, and I wrote my book, Gwadar on the Global Chessboard, and Gwadar can be linked all the way to southern Russia and Central Asia and all that. So that's Pakistan's interest, stability and peace in Afghanistan. But that doesn't mean that what Pakistan wants is the only thing that the others, like Indians, are still at war with Pakistan. I mean, you read what they've written on the fall of Kabul and what they're talking, and not only the Indians, the others also. So we have to be very careful onto this. And as far as the Afghan Taliban themselves are concerned, let us see all that has been talked about, or what they have professed, or how they interact with the international community, how they moderate, how they deal with the Afghans themselves, and how an inclusive government is. This is yet to be seen. We can support them, and we should support them in moderation and in other ways. But we have to keep Pakistan's national interest at the top, which is that, as I've been saying, and I've been saying it as chairman of Pakistan National Reform Movement, that the last Indian has to leave Afghanistan, because Indians are the spoilers. You won't have peace in Afghanistan if the Indians are sitting there. Since from the Indian point of view, and the DGISP have said the same, they have been using Afghanistan only as a springboard for a war, an asymmetrical terrorist war against Pakistan, the second front. So we have to make that first. And also, the next thing is, we have to tell the Chinese and the Afghan Taliban both what the Indians are up to, I mean, both in Afghanistan and killing Chinese in Pakistan, so that the Chinese and the Afghan Taliban also deal with the Indians. Besides,
hold that thought there, Brigadier Mir, because I want to actually take the discussion forward in that direction, as well as to the regional context. We'll come back to Pakistan, and of course the implications for Pakistan and what Pakistan will be facing perhaps in the coming days. But if we just go through some of the key players in the region, I'll come back to you, Ambassador Wazir Saab. Of course, we've got, as Brigadier Mir has rightly pointed out, that the Chinese are keeping a very close eye on developments in Afghanistan, and rightly so. They want to see a softer side of the Afghan Taliban, and whether or not they will fulfill or go through with some of the promises that they have laid bare. But also, we're talking about the Russians. They also, ironically, after the US withdrawal, also have a vested interest in the region, because they would not like to see the Central Asian countries being disrupted, or any spillover in that direction as well. So if we're just talking about the region at large, I mean, this has been a game changer in many ways. Who would you say are the key players right now who would be leading negotiations, perhaps behind the scenes, to sort of like get a sort of more of a sort of like holistic feel as to what the actual realities are on the ground aside of Pakistan? Which other country do you think it would be the Russians and the Chinese who would be spearheading this more so? We also hear of the Indonesians, who we understand that have been speaking in Qatar recently as well. The Malaysians are also voicing their concerns of a dispensation which is not as perhaps as harsh as we saw in the last regime. And Turkey as well, who is keeping a close eye. So of all these nations, who would you say would be perhaps the ones which would be worth keeping an eye on with regards to Afghanistan and in its relationships in the region?
Well, as you mentioned, all these countries are keeping a very close eye, or watching the situation in Afghanistan very closely, comparing it with the Taliban rule over Afghanistan during the 90s, when there was a serious concern of these states, particularly the Central Asian and Chinese also. But in the 20 years, the region's approach has changed, the Taliban attitude has changed. A lot of changes, I would say, overall have taken place. The situation cannot be taken back to 90s, when Soviet were considering the Taliban as almost the enemies, or Iran obviously coming almost to attack the Taliban to take revenge for the killing of their diplomats in Mazar-e-Sharif. So the situation has totally changed. I would say the Taliban have changed also their approach to within Afghan dealing with the people within the country, and its approach with the immediate neighbor and in the region or the world as a whole. We have seen their delegations visiting all these countries, Moscow, Iran, Central Asia, China, reassuring the countries that our country will not be used for any activity against you. Because Chinese concern obviously was for this Xinjiang province from the ETIM not to get stronghold within Afghanistan to be a problem tomorrow for them. And similar situation, Russia in a way thought for its backyard in the Central Asia that the militarism may not be exported to these places. So there also an assurance was given that we have no international agenda or anything with regard to spreading of Islam or our system, whatever outside of Afghanistan. And similar assurance were given to Iran. So the approach has that way changed. Now, all these countries, they want Afghanistan to be in peace. They want the return of peace to Afghanistan because in peaceful Afghanistan, their purpose is served much better than in a troubled Afghanistan. But there are other countries also seriously interested. The one has just left yesterday. Today was the last day for them to vacate it. It has left Afghanistan physically, but it has already declared that we are not washing off our hands from Afghanistan. We would be looking after our interest over there carefully.
Of course, that's understood, Brigadier Wazir, that the Americans they would still have a close eye on the remnants of what is going on in Afghanistan.
If you permit me, sure, I've not finished what I was going to say. If you permit me to conclude.
Sure. Go ahead, sir. Sorry.
Well, the Americans have deep interest, not only in Afghanistan, but in the region also. Want to contain China, want to keep an eye on Pakistan also. So that can be done in a troubled Afghanistan better than a peaceful Afghanistan. Similarly, India has deep interest in this region. It has invested a lot of money, around $3 billion in Afghanistan. So that would also like to carry forward or to carry on with the activities that our colleagues or friends just mentioned they were doing from Afghanistan against Pakistan. But now when peace returns, those militant elements will not be allowed to use Afghanistan. But my condition for that is it will be done only if a government which is acceptable to all the Afghans is, say, brought by the Taliban after having such long consultation with the other ethnicities, with the other leaders. It should be a government, as they say, of all-inclusive. Other ethnicities should be represented, women should be represented. So if that government comes in, then Afghans will accept, then the world body should accept, then peace will return. If there is a problem in that, or if that type of a government is not, say, formed, then I'm afraid things would not sail smoothly. And unfortunately, Afghanistan would be heading towards a problem again.
And of course, let me quickly bring in Moayyed Jafri. I mean, Moayyed, the other two guests have touched upon one of the biggest spoilers in the region, and that would obviously be those sat on the eastern border who have, as correctly pointed out, have had a huge stake in Afghanistan over the last decade or so, particularly in terms of their investments, in terms of their infrastructural investments more so. So it's understandable that India would be, as they always do, one would say, be beating their chests over this. But largely, I mean, how far do you think this has been a sort of a setback for India, given the fact that it was relying heavily on keeping Pakistan's western borders in turmoil, and as we have seen, the infiltration by their spy agency deep into Balochistan as well. I mean, how do you think there could be a possible a possible retort by India, albeit in a very, very sort of like proxy shadow way, but this time perhaps in more of a lethal and deadly way, maybe because they are all in and all out now, as like the Americans are, in a way?
Absolutely, and we're already seeing those ripples in the region. Today, LOC ceasefire was once again violated. One of Pakistani soldier or Pakistani civilian was martyred. This basically happened today. So when we talk about the unceremonious exit of the United States from Afghanistan, if you will, the second biggest loser in this game, if you were to call it, is basically India. And what portrays it clearly is the narrative that India has been selling. They've been all over the place with their understanding of the issue, even with their blame game. If you monitor Indian media and the way the discussion is being had in the Indian media, which is obviously, and especially mouthpieces which are known to represent the Indian state, they first blamed Pakistan for creating Taliban as their proxy and then taking over Afghanistan. And then they said that Pakistan basically is funding ISKP. Russia, once again, like today, the Russian foreign minister and the spokesperson said that the West should lead an international global conference to create economic opportunities to rebuild Afghanistan. So if you look at the past of, I'm sorry, I'm taking a little bit of time here, but we need to understand this point, that this can very clearly be seen in the scope of the Build Back Better paradigm versus the BRI paradigm, where India being the part of Quad and now becoming an increasingly strong ally of the United States would most probably play its role to thwart a possibility where Afghanistan is congenial enough to shoulder or to support part of the BRI. And Pakistan, as we all know, has multiple MOUs and pacts made with Central Asian states, which cannot be completed unless we have a stable and peaceful Afghanistan and a government in Afghanistan which is not inherently opposed to Pakistan's interests. So once a peaceful government in Afghanistan is in place, all these factors would play out, and they would play out against two major players. That is, the Western countries led by the US, because that is going to strengthen China, which the US has now clearly stated as its policy it views as enemy number one and competition number one, and number two, India, because if that plays out, Pakistan's economy would grow substantially, and so would China. And no country, if India sees Pakistan as its enemy, it wouldn't want to see Pakistan's economy growing and the country stabilizing even more. So it's basically an economic war more than it's that of a security situation by the end of the day, which makes it very probable that India is not just going to sit on it. It is most probably going to try to do all in its, all in its power to stop this from happening. Now, let's see to what ridiculous lengths can it go. It is proven in the past that it can be really, if you forgive the expression, stupid when it comes to the use of force, which has the dangerous potential of destabilizing the entire region. But let's just hope that the Indians, take a more sane step and try to understand the sensitivity of this matter going forward.
Absolutely right. We're going to take a short break here, and coming up on the other side, I would like to just take a look at some of the other intricacies of what's going on in Afghanistan. One of the primary objectives of all four of the presidencies who have been in and out of Afghanistan has been the elimination of Al-Qaeda. And we've seen in the recent past, especially when we look at the Syrian war, of the rise of ISIS. Now, it is quite evident that ISIS is present in Afghanistan, and this, as the Americans are saying, is choose your poison between ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and the Afghan Taliban. Are they all in the same boat? as they say. We'll have that and a little bit more after this break. Do stay with us. Welcome back. You're watching Indus Afghan Special on a historic day where history is repeating itself once again. The last of the US troops left Afghanistan on the stroke of midnight today. Its implications are far reaching for the region, especially for Pakistan, who has been on the receiving end of the fallout of the war which has taken place for the last 20 years or so. Now, just want to sort of change the focus of this discussion a little bit to try to understand how intricate the mechanics of Afghanistan are. There are now reports that ISIS, which to some degree had been dismantled by the US and the Allied forces as the Syria war was unfolding, has found its footholding by the name of ISIS-K, which exists, and it is understood that they themselves are at loggerheads with the Afghan Taliban. The Afghan Taliban, of course, want to stamp their authority, and now, obviously, we have the third player in all of this, which is Al-Qaeda, which the Americans say has been dismantled, and largely following the elimination of Osama bin Laden. So Afghanistan itself finds itself in turmoil to a certain degree. Whether or not the Afghan Taliban can reach out reconciliatory ways to ISIS or not remains to be seen. So let me just cross over now to Ambassador Wazir to shed some more light on this. It's an awfully difficult cauldron that has been bubbling over in Afghanistan for some time now, and this troika of the Taliban, of ISIS and Al-Qaeda still somewhat, or remnants of, remain. How do you see this playing out in the days to come? We've seen, of course, recently the Americans carried out a drone strike recently of what they described as ISIS-K targets within Afghanistan. Afghanistan's Taliban responding, saying it's been a breach of Afghan sovereignty. So is it a question of putting a foot forward and two steps backwards in many ways, because now we have a situation where ISIS-K now seems to be leading the charge to make some headway in this region. And if that seems to be the case and they're hurting American interests far overseas, this could spell more trouble for the region.
Well, I think we all know what relation Taliban and IS had in Afghanistan. The fight between the two was known, or is still known to everyone. Now, the question is, would the Taliban be able to eliminate IS or IS-K or KP for that? That is a question, but I look at it differently. I would not handle individually IS or Daesh or TTP or ETIM. I look at it from this angle, that if it all depends on the future dispensation that is to be announced by the Taliban, I hope in a day or two. If that is a government that we are all looking forward to, then I have no doubt that all these groups would be controlled by the government that comes in, because that will be acceptable to all the Afghans, to all the regional countries, to everyone almost, because everybody wants peace except for these militant groups who wants to find safe havens. So they will have no place for them in Afghanistan if that government comes in. But if that doesn't come, then the question is, how can we blame the Taliban only for they to control? Because then the country would not be under the Taliban rule. It will be Taliban like in the earlier stage, and some groups or people fighting against that. Now, I hope that doesn't come, because as we always say, that if Afghanistan is peaceful, the whole region will benefit and Pakistan will benefit the most. Or if it is in trouble, then everybody will suffer, but Pakistan will suffer the most. So similarly now is the situation where Pakistan has very good opportunities, good implications for Pakistan, positive implications for Pakistan, and unfortunately, if it turns bad, then negativity is also there. So it all depends, in my assessment, revolves around the setup that the Taliban brings into Kabul. If that setup is a good setup, a very thoughtful decision, a very, a decision which is acceptable, which is capable of controlling every inch of Afghanistan, then I have no doubt the Taliban in that capacity would be able to tackle all these people, to deny the use of Afghan soil against anyone for any militant group. But if that doesn't, then I don't see any possibility of their being thrown out of Afghanistan or safe havens denied to them, because behind them are big states. They are not individual groups or individual in their own right, but they are assets of some states or somebody behind it. They would be just waiting for them to come and help them. So I would be repeating myself by saying again and again that it all depends on the future dispensation.
Okay, let me just bring in Brigadier Nadir. Brigadier Saab, I just want to get your take on where you see Al-Qaeda in all of this mix. Of course, post Osama bin Laden, one would say that there's been far less recruitment, according to intelligence reports, vis-a-vis Al-Qaeda. Some of their operatives have been operating as lone wolves, as opposed to they did not have that same infrastructural capacity they once had to strike far away from Afghanistan in foreign lands. How badly do you think that their space has been compromised? And moreover, what do you think, or do you think perhaps, the Taliban can actually keep, without sounding rude in a way, is to keep a leash on them in many ways, because it was exactly this network, the Al-Qaeda network, which they sheltered, which got them into this mess 20 years ago?
Well, according to many American and global analysts, Al-Qaeda is no longer, Al-Qaeda was no longer in Afghanistan after the Americans came there. They were spread all over the world. They used to say that previously they were mostly in Afghanistan, and now they're all over the world, or many parts of the world. So that's not the only place it's militant or a terrorist or some kind of organization may have Afghanistan. And I think that if the Americans and the allies should have learned a lesson from this 20 years war, the Afghan Taliban should have also learned a lesson from this 20 years war, and that is that sheltering an organization like Al-Qaeda or somebody else will get them in trouble, as you just said yourself. And one of the reasons people are talking about President Biden and before him Trump making this deal with the Taliban, actually, besides America's war weariness, was this factor, which I'm going to relate to Al-Qaeda and other global such franchises. Basically, the Afghan Taliban, in American parlance, are considered territorial militants of not freedom fighters from the American point of view, but militants from the American point of view, that they are basically confined to Afghanistan, whereas Al-Qaeda and Daesh or others are considered global, or that they can strike United States or some European country or some other part of the world. So that's one big difference. So Afghan Taliban, if they are stable and if they need global assistance, which they do need, and global recognition, they may not be very keen or should not be keen on sheltering, as I've said, or allowing any such organization. And I say it's not just the name which matters. I mean, previously they used to talk of Al-Qaeda and then came Daesh, and tomorrow it may be another name. It's what they're up to that concerns the world or anybody. And I keep saying this because Pakistan National Reform Movement primarily talks of Pakistan. We are concerned with the world, but first we're concerned with Pakistan. We have to see who are those militant groups in Afghanistan or elsewhere who are striking or can do anything bad in Pakistan and supported by India. So that should be our first concern, which doesn't mean that we are overlooking the others, but our primary concern should be that Pakistan is not attacked for any terrorist attack doesn't take place from Afghanistan or, for that matter, Iran or anywhere else on Pakistan. That should be our first concern. But having said that, I agree with you that Afghanistan has to be stabilized. And I think that that's why I said earlier that we need to support the new regime in Kabul, and not only Pakistan, but the Chinese and the Russians and other Turks, of course, they're already interacting. But I go to the extent of saying, for this reason that you just mentioned, that even the Americans and the Western allies who previously, and I wrote it in my books, who previously were relying on geostrategy, that is, they were using the military instrument in Afghanistan, now need to come through geoeconomics or from the economic side to stabilize Afghanistan so that such groups or such things which bring about such big wars like global war on terror and all that, they do not get space in Afghanistan.
Absolutely. Just leave with the parting thoughts from Moayyed. Jafri. Moayyed, of course, Pakistan's interests are well documented, and Pakistan, is a difficult situation. It toes a very fine line. I mean, it's been credited for getting the Afghan Taliban to the negotiating table. It then is lambasted by the Indians time and time again, that it is the supporting factor in getting the Afghan Taliban into government, into overrunning the Afghan government. How difficult is Pakistan's role now, do you think, given the context of what has happened? I mean, it requires a very, very, very delicate balancing act to prevent the likes of TTP Pakistan from finding their way back into Pakistani soil, and that the Afghan Taliban do, to some degree, recognize the TTP. How important is it that Pakistan's negotiations with the Afghan Taliban are not misconstrued to be too overly or overtly supportive of the Afghan Taliban regime if and when Pakistan formally does recognize it?
It's kind of a damned if you do and damned if you don't situation for Pakistan when it comes to the Western world, to be honest. And you're absolutely right that Pakistan is right now in a position where it is expected to strike that magical balance somehow, where it is seen as being very supportive to Afghanistan and the future of Afghanistan, but not so much to the Afghan Taliban, who are supposedly going to run Afghanistan. So it's that kind of a conundrum which Pakistan has to walk the wire in this situation. And in my humble opinion, I believe Pakistan, one thing that would very clearly sort all its problems out of what to do and what not to do would be to do what everybody else in the world does most of the times, and that is prioritize its own national interests. Pakistan has suffered over 80,000 casualties, billions of dollars in financial losses due to this entire war on terror in Afghanistan and its spillover, like you've been mentioning yourself. So right now, Pakistan would need to be very clear when it comes to the negotiations with the Taliban. And they need to lay it out like Pakistan has been talking about TTP to the Taliban. And the negotiation in this regards, there's been multiple times it's been held, although it wouldn't be appropriate to talk about the outcome as for now because there's not been any official word out. But we need to understand that Pakistan is in a position right now where what it can do is that it can basically rally support and it can bring clarity to the world. I'd like to bring both the points that Ambassador Ayaz, Amir, and our other guests, basically, they both brought to the fore. Basically, Afghanistan is a multi-tribal, multi-ethnic country. And when Ambassador Wazir says that the government is going to define if ISIS, KP, or Al-Qaeda are going to prosper there, it basically means that the swell can happen if a particular tribe or a particular ethnicity feels disenfranchised by the Taliban government. And that dissent leads to factionization or, defecting to other terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda or for that matter, ISIS in any form of the manifestation that they'd want to create in Afghanistan. So, and the second part would be economic disparity, because we all know where that leads to. When there is economic disparity, when there is economic strife, people get frustrated, and that basically leads to a law and order situation and eventually a terrorism problem. So Afghanistan government would need to be inclusive. It would need to ensure that no ethnicity is left behind, no tribal entity is unrepresented. That way they can try to limit the spread of these ISIS, KP, or Al-Qaeda type situations. And Pakistan would need to be very clear with the Taliban that none of that would ever make way into this side of the border. And to make a very fine point at the end, in one of his recent interviews, Zabiullah Mujahid said something that should concern Pakistan as well. He was not entirely praising the fencing of the Durand line, and he said that they weren't really happy about it. He didn't outrightly condemn it or said that they were not, they would want it to be pulled down, but they said that they believe that it's basically an overkill and it should not be there. So that is another challenge that Pakistan now faces regarding border infiltration, because we all know how the presence of miscreant actors exists in Afghanistan, not Taliban, but the spoilers, as both of our other honorable guests have been pointing out. So those can spill into Pakistan. It can create a wider problem. So Pakistan will need to be very smart when dealing with the Taliban, and we all have seen how smart and at negotiations Taliban have been in the past. So we need to keep them honest as well. There shouldn't be any over-exuberance when it comes to the fact that, yes, we have avoided a second stretch on our western borders by eliminating the threat of the Ghani government and New Delhi's cahoots and collaboration together against Pakistan. But we'll also need to be mindful when it comes to how Taliban move forward with their aspirations, and if those could collide with Pakistan's national interests.
Okay, thank you very much, Moayyed Jafri, for joining us from Lahore. Brigadier Nadir Mir, the chairman of the Pakistan National Reform Movement, thank you for your time, sir, and Ambassador Ayaz, Wazir, thank you for your time as well. Indeed, lessons for everybody, lessons for the superpowers of this world who, once again, have been forced to leave with their tail between their legs, as often described. But however, I think the biggest challenges are for the people of Afghanistan themselves. Who do they elect? Who do they choose as their representatives? And whether or not the Afghan Taliban can actually formulate what everybody is talking about, is that inclusive Afghan-led government to bring regional peace and to bring prosperity to Afghanistan. This conundrum still remains unsolved. Till next time, I'm your host, Addiel Sabir. You've been watching an Indus Special on Afghanistan. Thank you for watching.